right, welcome back to the Novelty Podcast. My name is Alexandra, and I read from the perspective of what the reader owes the book.
And my name is Emily, and I read from the perspective of what the writer owes the reader.
Yep. And today we're really excited. Further announcements on East of the Moon.
East of the Moon, my debut novel. We actually have a cover, people.
Which you yourself designed.
I did, yes. This was actually a lot of fun to be able to design my own cover. Mm-hmm. I've heard a lot of authors talk about like the kind of a little bit of the letdown of like when someone else designs their cover and it's not at all what they envisioned and just having to accept that. Yeah. So that's one thing that I enjoyed. I actually got to be like, this is it. This is what the characters look like, you know? So we are up for pre-orders. We have ebook pre-orders and we have paperback pre-orders. And I'm also doing pre-order rewards, so you get like fun little character cards. If they come along with the signed paperback, or if you do an ebook, I have a link in my section that lets you sign up for pre-order rewards. So awesome. We are doing all the fun things with this release.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll have a link down below for you guys. So if you're interested in getting East of the Moon, which I finished, and so I'm going to brag about your writing a little bit, but I think you're really excelling.
Oh, so, thank you.
I think if you love snappy, quippy, I think your dialogue is like one of your number one skills.
Dialogue has always been like a thing where I just feel like that I'm much more comfortable writing dialogue, and everything else I'm like, okay, I need to really focus, but like dialogue just is like, let's do this.
It is so fun to watch these characters banter with each other. I think you've absolutely nailed that.
Thank you.
And I think you have written a super fun plot. We're going through multiple cities. We're going on adventures. There's gothic castles. There's Cairo unexpectedly. There's different types of like mythical creatures are being discovered. Lore about vampires and other things are being discovered. So it's a very good fun romp adventure story.
As I've continued, so I've finished the second book in the series and I'm planning out the third one. What I've realized is my world building is basically all of it is true. Yeah. All the monsters, all the mythology, all of it is true.
Yeah. You know? And they're all here right now.
And it might not look true exactly as we see it in the stories, but you get to encounter it because it's all true.
Yeah, it's super fun. So I'm really excited, and congratulations,
Thank you.
Emily, on releasing your first book.
It has been it was kind of a last minute decision in a way, but there was actually a moment where you were like, if it's a vampire novel, it should come out in October. And I'm like, yes.
Oh, did I say that? Whoops, sorry, pressure.
But you know what? It's true. It's true. And also, 7 people have pre-ordered. And that actually kind of makes me emotional because I'm like, 7 people want to read my book. And that's just like, oh.
Yeah, you never know until you put it out there who's going to respond to it and what's going to happen.
Every single person. I'm just, thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's get into the episode.
Let's do it. All right. So, what are we talking about today?
So I finished this brilliant novel by Kazuo Ishiguro called The Remains of the Day. This is not a new release or anything. This has been out for a long time. It's been adapted into a movie with Anthony Hopkins and Emma Thompson playing the 2 leads.
Oh, some big names.
Yeah, so, popular work. And I haven't seen the full movie, but I've seen scenes from it, and of course, brilliant performances from them. Is anyone surprised? But for me, Kazuo Ishiguro is a very interesting writer. If people don't know, he's obviously Japanese, as you can probably determine from his name. But he grew up in England, and so he has a foot kind of in 2 different cultures. Okay. His Japanese heritage, he spent a lot of time in Japan, but growing up in England, he's very familiar with British culture, etc., etc. And so this is very much a British book. But there's almost a level of over self-awareness or analysis to it that I think if a British person's writing about just purely, it's almost like it's the water that you swim in, so you don't know.
British are an interesting thing in that they are on a level really self-aware and have a propensity towards a lot of self-deprecation. But then there's stuff that I'm just like, did you not notice that about yourself?
Yeah. So there's a level of analysis and an analytical approach to the way that he's approaching and revealing British culture, I think, through this book that I think
it's kind of unique.
Yeah, it is really unique, but it's very insightful, very incisive. And the other thing is if you've been following me on social media for any amount of time, I've been really struggling with this idea of snobbery. I've been talking about it for 3 years on my TikTok. There have been multiple times where I've tried to sit down and write and do a whole video on my YouTube kind of expressing my ideas around snobbery, because as someone who loves classic literature, who loves the arts, who loves these things, and yet I feel very much like I don't want to be a snob, even though I like these things that are quote unquote high art, high class things to be into, intellectual things, and I don't want to make anybody else feel bad because like I enjoy them or because they're associated with being smart. It's like my intention is not to.
You just enjoy them for the enjoyment of them.
Yeah, I personally really do sincerely like them, and so the snobbery is something that I've been like struggling with for like years of my life because I've always had this interest and propensity and things like that to these types of works.
Things that we inherently, right or wrong, like associate with snobbery.
Right. And my foundational definition, and this may or may not be relevant to the rest of the conversation of like what makes snobbery, is that the truth of the matter is that all people have equal and inherent value, but not all works of art have equal and inherent value. Works of art have relative value to each other. Some works of art are better than others. And snobs actually flip that. They think that all art is sort of like untouchable. You can't criticize it. You can't come to it, and it's all superior. But humans have relative value. And what they do, because art has such a high place in their minds, is that they try to make themselves as close in proximity to these things that have this inherent and eternal value so that they feel better about themselves, and they try to shove you away from them so that they can be closer to it and you can be lower and further away.
Kind of live in this world that's like more devoted to art than to humans.
Right. And I think that that's sort of like gets at the fundamentals of what makes snobbery is trying to build this hierarchy between peoples. And for the typical snob, it's, association with the classics or with the arts or with things like that, particularly in our modern day. But, quite literally for a British person dealing in this book is set in between the two wars. Well, it's sort of, he's a bunch of his memories are about the time between the two wars. It's now post World War II, in the present moment as he's like reflecting on his career. But anyway, we'll get into that. It's like literally the aristocracy. It's literally the family you came from.
Right.
And so that's a very literal form of snobbery that, in America we try not to do so much here.
I mean, in some cases we're pretending like we don't do that, but we don't have it quite as inherent to our society as, especially the English society holds on to that strong.
Yes. Okay, so I want to talk first about let's get into a summary of the book and the main character.
What is this book is about?
So the sort of top level appearance of the plot is that our main character is a butler named Stevens, who's had a very long career serving a very high level household, which is it's, if you're going to be a butler, that's like the top of the servant class.
Right.
And then if you're going to be a butler at one of the, highest, most aristocratic houses, that's like the top of the butlers. And so for most of his career, he served a gentleman named Lord Darlington. Lord Darlington has since lost his house. It's post-World War II. He's lost his wealth, and now an American has come in and bought the house. So even though Stevens is still serving as a butler, it's very much declined in sort of the amount of prestige
right,
that it would be in this, and of course in this post-World War II era, there's just not as much of a servant class. The economy is shifting. You're much more of this capitalist economy is emerging. It's very, if you watched any of Downton Abbey, it's all of that stuff.
Right, because World War II basically breaks Britain. Their whole system has to be much of the country has to be rebuilt.
Quite literally. And so now it's okay, we have to, make the land productive. These vast swaths of land that used to just be parks and hunting grounds and blah blah blah, it's turned into farming land or tenants or housing or all of these things. So it very quickly transforms them into what we see as a modern capitalism, as extracting labor and resources out of the people that are nearby,
and the hierarchy becoming more about wealth than anything else.
Exactly. And so what's also kind of happening in this book is that Stevens has this opportunity to go on this road trip. So you're just with him for a couple of days, but it's we get inside of his head and we're kind of just on this while he's driving around doing this road trip, thinking about his career, reflecting on his career, and reflecting on the housekeeper that was working with him throughout most of those years with Lord Darlington. Mm-hmm. And in that process, he's spending a lot of time talking about what does it mean to be a great butler. It's a little bit stuffy and silly. But he also reflects on his dad. So his dad was also a butler in a high house, blah, blah, blah. And at the end of his career, he brings his dad to come work as an under butler at Lord Darlington's because he's older now. He's not as vigorous, not as able, blah, blah, blah. And we see how even when you're a butler, you're doing labor, the labor of your body. And your position is only as secure as your ability to do that labor. And there's this heartbreaking scene that I want to read from this book that is absolutely just, you're watching his dad be in this state of decline where it's like, now he can't even be an under butler very well. So there's this scene where Stevens and the housekeeper lady are watching, they're on the second floor and they're watching his dad outside. And my father could be seen standing by those 4 stone steps, deep in thought. A breeze was slightly disturbing his hair. Then, as we watched, he walked very slowly up the steps. At the top, he turned and came back down a little faster. Turning once more, my father became still again for several seconds, contemplating the steps before him. Eventually, he climbed them a second time, very deliberately. Then he continued on across the grass until he had almost reached the summer house, then turned and came walking slowly back, his eyes never leaving the ground. In fact, I can describe his manner at that moment no better than the way Miss Kenton puts it in her letter. It was indeed as though he had hoped to find some precious jewel he had dropped there. And what we've learned later, and this isn't revealed in this moment, is that he has been struggling going up and down the stairs in the house. He's been struggling carrying, trays and that sort of thing. And so you realize he's doing exercise. He's an old man struggling to do exercise, and the jewel that's in the grass as he's contemplating his future, this old man who's now in decline, is his own self-respect because he cannot hold the position he once did.
Okay, right.
And it's Stevens himself isn't really consciously able to make that connection, even though he himself feels like he has a decline in prestige because he's now serving this wealthy American and not even somebody who's British, let alone part of the aristocracy. So that is what's going on the surface level of this book. What's going on underneath this book is really, really interesting because as Stephen slowly reveals what happened in Lord Darlington's house, you go, oh, no. Lord Darlington, no, don't do that. No, Lord Darlington, no, don't do that. And you come to realize that Lord Darlington, in the time between the 2 world wars, is becoming increasingly sympathetic to German aristocrats. He has one particular friend that he sees his life is in decline. He's losing his position. He's losing his power. That man becomes homeless. He loses all of his wealth. Lord Darlington, of course, is reflecting on what that means for him as an aristocrat. Is his social position also very insecure? He becomes increasingly sympathetic to the German plight. He thinks the Treaty of Versailles is too harsh. We got to go lighter on these guys. We made them pay too much for World War I. But at the same time, guess who's coming to power? We all know it's the Nazis. It's Hitler. And so as he's advocating for this, he is bringing together diplomats, world leaders in his home in secret meetings to try and get there to be a connection of peace and collaboration between German leadership and the British.
And by German leadership, we mean
Nazis. That's right. We mean Hitler, we mean Nazis. And there were actually quite a few, this is very accurate to the time, there were actually quite a few British aristocrats who really did have Nazi sympathy.
The prince at the time had to actually be removed from England when the war really gets in place because he is so sympathetic to the Nazis that everyone is mortified by him and is kind of just like, we need to ship him away and not allow him to say anything out loud. Because the sympathy for the Nazis was so deep in the British aristocracy and the monarchy itself. We tend to really think
he and his wife do a tour in Germany,
I believe they do.
World War II really breaks out.
He ends up getting literally shipped to an island. They're like, no, we cannot allow him to be. Because he was committed. This was not just I felt like I have some sympathies and I feel really bad. No, he was committed to this ideology and this was at one point going to be the King of England, and that obviously got waylaid. And I think everybody was kind of we missed a bullet there.
Yeah. And so that is sort of what's being depicted here. And then there are moments where Stevens is caught in this world where he wants to be extremely loyal to his lord. Right. There's almost this almost like going back to the Middle Ages, his liege lord,
right.
this like sense of profound loyalty, not just like, oh, I'm obligated to him because he's my employer, although that's also there, because we have seen here's the bodily decline and the economic decline of his father, who has a tiny little room up in the attic somewhere that's sad and empty and gray,
right,
as his body gives out. So that you can see that being kind of in the background of what he's thinking about. So it's like quite literally, you pay my paycheck, you are my employment. The role that and the level of prestige that I have in this society is tied to your prestige.
Right, because like there is a level of like one purpose in being a servant, like like I have meaning in this like thing, but also there's a level of like, well, I'm not like the people who are in factories, or I'm not like the like actual working class. Like to be a servant in a an aristocrat's home means that I'm better than a lot of people.
Right. And so then there's this way in which like Stevens cannot face the truth of what's blatantly happening in front of him.
Right.
And he has to kind of make excuses for Lord Darlington. And the biggest conflict that comes in this story between himself and the housekeeper is there is a moment where Lord Darlington says, there's a couple of people in this household who are Jewish servants. They need to be let go immediately. And that is what kind of breaks the housekeeper, and you see her start at that point to make moves to get married, to get out of service, to move away from this house. And it takes her time too. She also is like, I still have to like work here. I feel bad about this. I know this isn't right. And when Stevens delivers that news to her, because some of them are maids, so she has to fire them because they're under her purview. She's like, this is wrong.
Yeah.
And Stevens is like, well, but Lord Darlington, and he cannot face, and he cannot bring himself to say the truth of like just simply calling a spade and calling this wrong, calling it for what it is.
Yeah.
And even as he's seeing, these political movements happen, he cannot face the truth of like who Lord Darlington was and what he did and how it hurt England, even though he himself is obviously a representation of the power of England in part.
Right.
Later on, we see there is one really interesting scene which reveals that Stevens does understand deep down inside. When he becomes the butler under the American, there are some Americans who come through who are friends of his who are like, oh, he's a real butler in a real British house. And they're like all fascinated about it. And they're like, oh, tell us about Lord Darlington. And he refuses to acknowledge that he worked for him. And I think that speaks to the shame that he feels around his role with that. Even if he can't bring himself even to think about it, that there is an understanding that what happened was wrong, and he was party to it by serving this man.
Well, because obviously, like, if he's reflecting on that, he's reflecting on it from the place of a broken England.
Yeah.
And, like, what Lord Darlington was supporting basically destroys England as he knows it.
Right.
England never goes back to being what it was pre-World War II. A lot of the systems are destroyed. A lot of the country itself is destroyed. They go through years of hardship with food scarcity and disease and things like that. Ultimately, the things that Lord Darlington supports destroys the country that he supposedly loves.
And I think too, anti-Semitism was a widespread belief across Europe and in England at the time. And one of the things that I think is interesting to kind of talk about is that Nazis were happy to work with people who are going to have similar beliefs along those lines. Even if Lord Darlington never would have been like, yes, the one Aryan race, he never would have been like, oh, the Ubermensch.
Yeah.
Because he thinks he's the best one.
Yeah.
The British think they're the most important ones. But they're all happy to kind of build these alliances around anti-Semitism where that does align them.
Which, to be clear, I feel like when I say there's a history of anti-Semitism in England, people are like, no, you can still go to churches today that have existed for centuries that have horrific Jewish stereotypes in the stained glass windows. They specifically portray Jewish people as demons coming to eat your children.
Yeah.
It is deep in that culture.
Yeah, and so I think too, as with many people, they didn't really understand how far Hitler was willing to take it.
Right.
And especially in the pre-war period, there was some understanding later on in the war. It wasn't really the end of the war and we found the concentration camps and the death camps. That comes out kind of mid-war.
Yeah.
When
people start escaping and getting out with the stories.
Yeah.
And then it becomes do we believe that? Because that is a lot to believe.
Yeah, and it's like, oh, well, that's then the logical conclusion of the hatred that you've been espousing.
Right.
But they didn't really understand, you know, there's no way that Lord Darlington pre-World War II would have really understood that this was going to lead to that. Yeah, to that pile of bodies over there, you know?
I mean, there were people who did know that. And just nobody listened to them.
Right.
Because there was, like, obviously, like, I feel like Lord Darlington is someone who probably lives in a little bit of a fantasy land, you know, and just thinks this is all going to work out and it's all going to be fine, you know? And, like, that, I feel like we kind of give, not that I'm saying that you're doing this by any means, but, like, I feel like history kind of, like, is a little bit light on those people because, like, well, they didn't understand. It's like, well, that's a choice that they made.
And I think, too, it's like what the fundamental issue is that now we get to say, okay, then I'm not going to be party to a whiff of this.
Yeah.
Now I know that I will not stand for a whiff of this. And also, guess what? Being anti-Semitic is wrong, whether you're putting it in stained glass windows, whether you're writing political cartoons showing Jews as having large noses and being gross, or whether you're putting them into death camps. Of course, death camps is the most extreme consequence of that kind of hatred, but that hatred is fundamentally wrong no matter what.
Well, and also, like, the concentration camps is not it's the most severe massacre up to that point. It's not the first massacre directed towards Jewish people throughout Europe.
I mean, just a couple of decades before that, you have the Jews being persecuted in Russia.
The pogroms coming through, and like there's history in multiple European countries. Patrick O'Brien wrote a short story about this, I think in Spain, which, like, he's talking about, like, mid-century of, like, this tradition of on Easter weekend going out and burning down like homes or businesses owned by Jewish people as, like, retribution for what you did to Jesus. Like, this was a part of the culture.
This happened actually across Europe, to, like, beat them in the town square kind of thing.
Like, that was how they celebrated Easter. Fantastic.
Yeah.
So, like, I do, like, whenever I talk about this with people, like, nobody really knows that history, that, like, this was not, like, something that just sparked out of nowhere and there's no, like, wow, that just happened type of thing. Like, no, this is European history. Like, being anti-Semitic and violence towards Jewish people is a part of that culture.
Yeah. And I think, you know, if you're, I've talked about it here and there that I'm, like, working my way through this book. It's very dense. It's very heavy. Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt. But the first section of this book is, like, going back to, like, the Rothschilds in the 1100s being, like, lenders to various royal princes as they have, like, European wars. And so, like, that heritage of them, of a few select Jewish families, the Ashkenazi Jews living in Europe but not being considered sort of, like, belonging to any one country, and, like, statehood not really being a thing between, really up until right before World War I. And so they saw them as sort of, like, neutral third parties who would help them, like, broker these treaties. And in the brokering of the treaties, there was the transfer of monies.
Right.
And they were also the ones allowing for the funding of the wars, because they got into banking and that sort of thing. So you see the seeds of both, like, this fear and this respect that goes back to, like, the Middle Ages, just because of the way that politics emerged and society emerged, after the collapse of Rome in Europe.
Right. Yeah, this is deep. This is what, like, we were basically just building to this. So it's not a matter of, like, this didn't come out of nowhere. We'd been building towards this for centuries, really.
Yeah. Okay, I have another quote because I happened to, like, pick this up after I finished this book, and I was like, oh, that explains it. So I have another quote here for, like, why there is this sort of similarity in race thinking between the British and the German, which I have to find the quote. Okay, so while the seeds of German race thinking were planted during the Napoleonic Wars, the beginnings of the later English development appeared during the French Revolution, and may be traced back to the man who violently denounced it as the most astonishing crisis that has hitherto happened in the world, to Edmund Burke. The tremendous influence of his work exercised not only on England but also on German political thought is well known. The fact, however, must be stressed because of resemblances between German and English race thinking as contrasted with the French brand. These resemblances stem from the fact that both countries defeated the tricolor and therefore showed a certain tendency to discriminate against the ideas of liberté, égalité, and fraternité. So, And I think that, you know, we see this kind of in English culture where it's like, yeah, we can extend the vote to everyone, but I mean, should we be doing that to people who don't go to the good and proper schools like we do?
Yeah.
You know, should I really be trusting the lower classes with the leadership of this country? Like, there's very much a resistance because of their clinging to the monarchy, because of their clinging to the aristocracy, because of their clinging to, like, their snobbery around education, hierarchy with these things. They're very resistant to these ideas of true equality, egalite.
Right.
And they look down on the French, who, as she rightly points out, they've defeated in war for, like, really espousing these ideas with vehemence and conviction.
Right. All right. I want to take us on a bit of a segue. Same topic and yet not. So my husband has been reading Wolf Hall, which is about, you know, King Henry VIII's court and, like, all the drama that comes around that. And he brought up Sir Thomas More's Utopia. Yeah. And I was like, oh, I know this. And here's how I know this. Because Drew Barrymore's character Ever After was very devoted to Utopia. That was the movie of my teenage years. Watched that like 15 times. So I'm like, yes, I know this, because her character is, like, constantly quoting Utopia to the King of France, and it's supposed to kind of betray, like, the King of France is, like, actually listening, or the Prince of France. And my husband was like, well, that clearly didn't take, and I'm like, excuse me, no. Like, of all the countries in this ecosystem, in this era, France is the first to say, like, we're not doing this anymore.
Yeah, we're done with monarchy, we're done with the aristocracy.
Turns out people are equal, and we're not going to be like, oh, because of your father, you get to rule us, you get to speak on behalf of God, like, like, just because of who you were born to does not mean that you get the inherent right to punish us for our existence, right? Yeah.
And I think a lot of people, like, set up this false dichotomy between, like, the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and they criticize the French Revolution for...
Yes, for, in essence, like, the idea of, like, oh, the American Revolution was better because they didn't reject God. The French Revolution, revolutionaries rejected God. Yeah. And I'm always just like, that is entirely a misconception, because if you were rejecting the monarchy in France, you have to reject God, because those two are so melded together that you are taught your entire life when the king speaks, he speaks for God.
Right.
You know, there's no way to separate those two. You've never been asked to separate those two. You've always been told they exist in the same thing.
The divine right of kings is foundational upon a theological principle.
Right, exactly. So there's not any way to separate those. There's not any way for it to be like, oh, I don't want a monarchy, but I still want to be a Christian. Like, this, we're not... This is not a thing. You cannot look at this from 21st century evangelical eyes and be like, I judge now, you know?
Yeah, and I think there's this really interesting scene that happens in A Man for All Seasons, either the play or the movie, if you've seen it, which is about Sir Thomas More. So Sir Thomas More is sort of like the head of the church under Henry VIII. The Catholic Church, as Henry VIII is, like, trying to say, like, oh, I want to get rid of the Catholic Church, and instead install the Church of England, which weirdly involves him becoming the head of the church, even though, like, he doesn't have a vocation in the church or has never gone to...
It's very convenient.
Yeah, very convenient, according of power to himself. Weird how he did that. And so there's this scene where the Spanish diplomat, which, like, Catherine of Aragon, the first wife who King Henry is trying to divorce, is Spanish, so that's why, like, so the Spanish diplomat is, like, coming and having, like, a private conversation with him, and he's like, so I hear you're in support of Spain because you're Catholic. And he's like, no, I'm an Englishman. Like, I 100% am here to serve my country. I'm completely loyal to England. And he's like, oh, so then you're Protestant. And he's like, no, I'm Catholic. And so this idea that, like, these things were one and the same, like, Sir Thomas More was so unique in his own time to differentiate these things that it was confusing for people of his era.
Like, inherently, when we're talking about religion during this time, we're talking about political systems.
Right.
Like, you're not talking about just religion. There's no just religion in these countries.
Yeah.
You know, and also, like to suggest that people who are living in a colony separated by months of seafare from like their monarchs are inherently better than the people who are fighting this out on the street and are literally giving their lives for this. Like stop. Yeah. Just like, let's talk about snobbery here.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, like, this idea of, like, you know, like the whole American, like, experiment of religious freedom is coming from from this network of, like, this co-alignment of religion with politics. Like, if you were a peasant who was tied to the land and your lord decided that for political reasons he was going to switch from being Catholic to Protestant, so did you.
Yeah.
Because the church was tied to his house, which is where you went, which is where the priest was. or the pastor or whatever, the vicar, whatever,
who's probably the like third son of the landowner.
Right, exactly. And so like that is part of the reason, and they would switch all the time for political reasons. And so that is part of the reason why people who had deep religious convictions were like, I don't have to switch just because you're switching political alliances. I want to be able to choose my faith for myself. And that's why you see people, from England, from France, going to like be German Huguenots and then going from there, blah, blah, blah.
But also that really kind of delegitimized religion for a lot of people. Like for a lot of people, like you were openly religious so that you celebrated like the feasts and the like all that just to
the
like
liturgical calendar.
Yeah, but like it wasn't really about faith because it is like everyone is pretty aware this is a political system, and so that's why like Puritans and Huguenots look kind of extreme because these people are like, it's actually about faith, and everyone else is like, where I'm just trying to survive.
Yeah,
like
I'm just like living in this world.
Yeah, I'm just trying to like have enough food to feed my family.
Yeah.
It's not really like we're just trying to survive here.
Yeah, and then on top of that, I think like another criticism that like is laid against, which you started to touch on, like the French Revolution for like being too extreme and being too bloody, and like they didn't have to kill all those people. Like that was crazy, and it's like, well, when you're talking about like that type of thing, like the more apt comparison is like they're doing a civil war.
They're doing a civil war.
Like let's take a look at the American Civil War and how bloody that was,
and how more Americans died in the American Civil War than all other conflicts combined. Like we do bloody here too. Like, but we just want, because we're snobs, we just want to be like, but our bloody is more superior than your bloody.
Right, and like and to your point, like the American colonist was not going to get on a boat, a little trimaster, and take 9 months to sail across the ocean blue the other way and be like, King George, I'm cutting your head off now. Right. Because they're so geographically non-co-located, it's just not going to happen. I mean, versus like the French are having a civil war.
They are fighting on the streets of Paris, doing like, I honestly like respect that a bit more, if I'm honest.
Yeah, they're willing to stand behind their convictions, and that's like exactly what this quote is about, is that there's a degree to which like the English and the German are like, well, I mean, we wouldn't go that far. And so as a result, that like snobbery, that sense of hierarchy has been installed in their culture, and they still haven't let it go. To this day, British people are kind of like, well, they're like the last to get rid of their monarchy.
Oh yeah, like most of Europe right now is like divesting themselves of monarchies, and like a lot of monarchs are now like working in actual jobs and like being asked to support themselves because that money should actually be going to the country. Right. And England is one of those like last ones that's like trying to hold on to a monarchy as a monarchy has always been, like these figureheads, right? And like I don't think it's fair to say like, oh, and all of England wants this. There's a large and growing percentage of people who are like, I'm actually tired of this, know? Like,
and especially because King Charles is just not that popular.
I mean, but like, how can he be? Like, whatever he inherited, it was not the personality for this job.
Yeah, he's not the personality hire. That's true.
No. So yeah, like England is kind of weird in how long it has held on to at least this being like a part of our figurehead. But like what I think is kind of interesting that people are talking about in terms of like that we've never talked about in terms before, and like what that monetarily looks like, because obviously like Britain and British countries and England, Scotland, obviously like the world is going through a lot of economic upheaval. A lot of people are really struggling economically, and when you look at what like Prince William inherited monetarily when Queen Elizabeth died, it is more than any one human being could ever spend in their entire life. Yeah. So he's just going to go and put it in a bank, and it's going to sit there indefinitely while a lot of people in the country are living on the streets and barely surviving. And like that's what monarchy actually means into the 21st century.
And that's what it meant in the French Revolution. Yeah. I mean, it was the economists have said this over and over again. When you get to an economic disparity, the likes of which we are approaching and surpassing right now, that's when you see these revolutionary changes happening. That's also what like was behind that type of revolution was fomenting at the turn of the century in America too, with the like robber barons and all of that. And certain political changes were made because they were like, oh snap, I don't want my head to roll. Like they would literally were like, oh my gosh, it's going to be another French Revolution. My head is going to roll in the streets.
That was something that was really interesting when I went to Venice in 2019, which was like a city-state, for like a millennia that they had, that like the entire system just functioned in and of itself.
Yeah.
And there certainly were problems, but it was like, it did not fall from within, which is usually the story.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really interesting. And then I went to a museum that was like basically like, oh, and this is what the middle class were living like. They were living very well. And it's like, this is why we stood for so long. If you're middle class is doing this well, your country will stand.
Yeah, it's a common marker of the strength of both the economy and also the political system that you have a robust middle class.
Right.
One which we are rapidly losing today in our country. So
there's that.
But, okay, so which is a great segue because I did want to talk about our country. So I want to kind of come back to this idea of like, how dedicated are you to this idea of equality versus, hierarchy, snobbery, whatever, trying to set yourself up, say that someone is better than somebody else because of whatever reason, whatever stupid reason you want to get.
For whatever your scale is.
Yeah.
And your scale is not better than everyone else's, let's be clear.
Yeah. So if you're not going to be like 100% dedicated to this idea of equality, once sort of snobbery and hierarchy comes in, it becomes a toehold for more extreme ideas like Nazism to come in, like race thinking to come in. And in America, I think it's really hard for us to identify what snobbery looks like, because snobbery that looks like this with the Lord Darlingtons of the world, with the poshest accent that is ever poshed, that is ever accented, in the world, like, it's very easy for us to go like, oh, well, that's snobbery, But in American culture, I think a lot of times where snobbery appears is really in our pride around the blue-collar worker, the man who tills the earth with his hands, the rancher, the farmer, the salt of the earth, somebody who knows how to be tough, who knows how to be rugged, who knows what a hard day's work really looks like.
Which, to be clear, none of those are indicators of actual morality.
Yeah.
There's not an inherent right or wrong in that. But we've made an inherent right and wrong in that. That
is a superior way to be.
Yeah, exactly. And we then translate that into like, oh, if your job is going to an office, you're inherently inferior.
Yeah, you're weak, you're a pencil pusher, you sit in front of a computer, you're effete. And this type of like snobbery, I mean, it has its roots back into like ancient Roman culture. Right. The Romans also had this fantasy of this soldier farmer. It's like the soldier who would go out to the front, who would, spend his first 20 years of his life serving the Roman Empire, defending it, and then he would come back and humbly till the ground, and like be in one of the outer regions, the latifundia, and like be this like noble farmer working the land and supporting the from there. And they really looked down on the Greeks for being intellectuals, for being effete, for being soft, for caring about art and culture and all of these things. Does that sound familiar? There's a certain sort of anti-snobbery that's emerging, like in America, of like being a coastal elite, of having a college education and thinking white ivory tower. You sit in your white ivory tower, you don't know what real life is like. You can't handle the truth. This is deep, deep bedrock in American culture.
Which, to be clear, if you go and you work in an office, you still are struggling to pay your bills. You know what life is like because you have to pay your bills. You have to feed yourself. You have to feed your kids. You're doing all of the things
and you're filled with a certain kind of like existential dread of like knowing how useless the work is that you do.
Yeah, inherently, like 99.9% of people who work in an office are of the same economic status as somebody who's working in the fields, because we're all just like in the existence level. We're all just paying our bills and making our food and taking care of our kids and existing. And so this idea of like, because I work with my hands, I care more about my family. It's just like, what?
Or that what real life is.
Yeah.
And like these other people are idiots. They don't really know what real life is. And I think, when we take a look at American history, of course, like our biggest struggle has been race-based slavery.
Right.
And that has been the defining struggle of our culture. And so we see this kind of snobbery raise its ugly head when the lines where slavery existed at the root of our culture are really messed with. So whether it's the emancipation of the slaves or whether it's the the extension of the vote to the black populace, then that's where we really see conflict arise. And it arises primarily between the poor white person and the formerly black slave or the formerly disenfranchised black person who couldn't vote before.
Right.
And it arises along these economic concerns. because they're of a similar economic position. So the only way that you're going to make yourself quote unquote better than the person
right.
is to say, well, at least I'm white and I'm not black.
Right, exactly. When if you actually looked at like circumstance, you know, circumstances are similar. You both are just fighting to feed yourselves. Like, and a lot of this is what we're talking about, like day-to-day subsistence is the survival level. I've talked about like my husband's grandmother was a family of sharecroppers in the South.
Yeah.
And like it was year in, year out. They would work the fields for someone else. And then the farmers would tell them, like, we'll pay you next year. We'll pay you next year. I promise we'll pay you next year.
Tell me how that's not slavery when you're working for free.
Exactly. You're working for free. Your family is borderline starving because all you've got is, like, a little bit of brains that you've, like, kept for yourself. You know, and then, but instead of uniting with the black people in the area that are similarly just barely, you know, surviving and trying to get food for themselves, it's like, oh, but I'm white.
Yeah.
You know, like, so there's that.
So there's that. At least I'm that.
Yeah, exactly.
Know? And I think even today, so when I kind of, you know, look at like where we are politically, so here's where we get a little controversial, which this shouldn't be controversial. This is just straight up. Anyway, the first time I really noticed a big increase in like Nazi dog whistles, Nazi symbols being used and publicly, and kind of Nazi propaganda and rhetoric kind of emerging much more so in our culture was when I saw the Jan 6 insurrection. I saw people with swastika t-shirts, where you know, carrying flags with the SS symbol on it, things like that. And then, you know, we come to the 2020 election and we have Elon Musk doing 2 full Sig Heils on the inauguration day,
and to be
on
clear,
the stage for the inauguration.
And clear, later confirming on Twitter that that's exactly what he was doing.
And his MAGA hat being in the font, the classic Nazi font.
But like he straight up admitted, like that's what he's doing. Like
Yeah.
for all the people who are like, that's not really, yes, that's he confirmed.
Well, and he has a long history of saying all kinds of anti-Semitic stuff on Twitter. So like, anyway, you guys do with that what you will. If you don't want to reconcile with reality, that's fine. That's for you to spend your time doing. I'm not here to convince you. So, and I think, you know, when we kind of look at what are the concerns, we're seeing that the rural white voter is concerned along economic lines. How much did eggs cost? And we see that this kind of rhetoric has a toehold in these historic, long-term hierarchies that have been established in our culture. And what do we see? We see Nazism being ushered in through the back door.
Right, exactly. And it's like all of the signs are there.
Yeah. So, you know, and this is just, we have to pay attention to this. This is something that we cannot bury our heads in the sand about. We have to pay attention to this. This is too important. We've seen this go in horrible, murderous directions in the past. This is the inheritance of that tradition. You cannot, you know, if you care about humanity, if you care about your neighbor, if you care about your brother and your sister and your family member and the people in your community.
Honestly, like on some level, if you care about yourself,
yes, you know. That like you cannot allow a whiff of this kind of thinking, this kind of philosophy, this kind of ideology to enter into this world. It has to be rejected at face value.
You can't dabble in it.
We have to 100% say, no, all men and women were created equal. I don't care what your creed is. I don't care what your skin color looks like. I don't care what your religion is. I don't care what your disabilities are. I don't care about any of that. We have to affirm the intrinsic and inherent equality of all people, no matter what.
I would throw sexuality in there as well.
Yeah.
Like none of these things matter because inherently the idea of the country that we supposedly all love is that we're all equal, and there's no indicator that says, but except you.
Yeah.
Like there's no indicator for that.
And we cannot let a toehold in because these ideologies still exist. They're extremely powerful. They're extremely persuasive because it's very easy for all of us to fall victim to the idea that I can feel better about myself if I can feel better than you.
Right. That's a false.
And it's
sense.
false.
So, like you actually will like this is where
you never really feel better about yourself.
No, you just ultimately feel angry and bitter and upset and blaming the reason that I don't feel good is because these other people are allowed to exist. And if I could just get rid of these other people, then I would feel better about myself. Yeah. And it just never works.
It never works. This is the path of genocide. This is the path of untold horrors, and we have to stand against it.
This is the path of destroying your own country.
Yeah.
Like if you love this country, we're on a path of destruction.
100%.
Like, let's be clear. Germany did not survive World War II. It was destroyed as much as Britain was.
And Lord Darlington, I know it's a fictional novel, but it's exploring something that really did happen.
And it's based off of real people.
Yeah. It's like he dies alone, sad, without his money, lost his title, lost his land, lost his beloved home, lost everybody who served and was around him and was loyal to him.
And cared about him, right? Yeah. Because this is not a system in which anyone wins. Yeah. Ultimately, everybody loses.
100%. So, I think we can put a pin in it there. Light and uplifting stuff from a lovely jaunt today.
Back to tea.
Yeah. So thank you guys so much for listening to us. I hope you enjoyed my dissection of this novel and sort of the history that was behind it and also the connections to totalitarianism. And I hope you will sincerely consider the plea that I put before you, that really standing firm on the equality of all people is the way that we defeat these kinds of evil ideas.
And it's the way society, like we're talking about this destroying society. Society functions when we're equal. Like, let's be clear. Like, we've got this like myth of if we're all equal, we're all poor. That is not the reality. Reality is when we see ourselves as equal, society actually functions, and it functions well, and it's there for, like, yes, there will always be parts of society that like fall between the cracks and need support, but like society actually functions far better in a system in which people are considered equal.
100%. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and don't forget to check out Emily's new book.
Yes, thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.